weekly educational webinar series in which Scott Bradley talks and tries to make the principles that this country was founded on more popular and more well-known. We've got two panelists with us tonight, and I'm really excited to introduce them. First, I'm just going to let you know my name is Joy, and I'm your host for the webinar tonight. And with us, we have Scott Bradley, our regular Scott Bradley. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And again, it's our second webinar since you accepted the nomination to run on the Darrell Castle ticket as Vice President. So thank you for being here. And Scott, we have a really exciting guest with us tonight, and I'm going to let you do the introductions because you're going to do it better than I am. So I'm going to turn the time over to you for just a second, and then I'll explain how the attendees can ask questions.
Sounds great. It's a real pleasure to be back with everybody. We have regular attendees, and we have some that join us new every time. And today we've got somebody that we've never had on before, and it's a real honor for me to be able to introduce Darrell Castle, who's the presidential candidate for the United States President for or through the Constitution Party. Darrell is the real deal. I tell people that every chance I get. There's many people that, well, they change parties, they change positions. They call them flippers in some circles. They seem to put their finger in the wind and try and figure out maybe how they can obtain more votes because they sound more acceptable to a larger audience. But I think that their character and their true beliefs are oftentimes obfuscated to the group that they're presenting to. And having known Darrell for as many years as I have, I've found him to be that not shaken like a reed. He's been steady, he's been consistent, he's been filled with principle and character. And I tell people also that when Darrell talks, we need to listen because there's some sound doctrine that we're going to hear. Darrell is he was with the Constitution Party when it took its first breath. He was back in 1992 when the party was started. It was a different name at the time. I think the name is far better now. I love it. The Constitution is really what is this really, truly magnificent charter of the nation. And so I think it tells more about what we're about than what was then. But Darrell's been with the party ever since the beginning. Darrell has kind of shepherded and helped the party to be able to grow and to progress and to gather momentum. And so I think it was absolutely a no-brainer this year when the convention in Salt Lake City in the middle of April drafted Darrell. They basically said, this is the man we want to carry our banner. And I'm so pleased that they made the right decision. And if people are looking for something that's going to be stable, that's going to be true to the cause, that's going to be valiant in all the things that this nation truly needs at this time, I think that they can feel just magnificent that they've got Darrell to vote for. So, Darrell, I don't know. I probably ought to say a lot more, but maybe you'd be embarrassed. So I'd like to maybe turn a little. Well, Emily, do you want to come back and tell us a little bit about anything before I turn time over to Darrell?
All right, let's do that really quick. And Darrell, what an introduction. Thank you so much for being here. We are honored, and we're very excited to hear from you. So thank you, Darrell. Before we get started and we turn the time over to Scott and Darrell, I just want to explain to the attendees that they can ask questions. And I know that there's going to be a lot of questions, and it's an honor to be able to ask them directly to you guys. So the way you're going to ask questions tonight is you're going to see on a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and there's the word question. Next to the word question, you'll see a little plus sign. Click on that little plus sign, and you'll be able to type your questions into us. The questions will come directly to myself as I am host, and I will ask the questions to Scott and Darrell, and they can kind of decide who's going to answer the questions at that point. As with all of our webinars, they are recorded. All the recordings are going to go up on our social media sites, so you can watch the recordings. You can circulate them with your friend. If you've registered, you will receive the recording automatically. If you registered and you were not able to attend, you'll still receive the recording. So let's spread these recordings out there like wildfire. Let's spread the word. Also, they will go up on the website soon, and we will also at the very end of the webinar be promoting and showing you what we're going to do on our following webinar next Tuesday at the same time, same place. So that being said, Scott and Daryl, I'm going to turn the time over to you. I will hold off until the last 15 minutes or so to start asking questions. So just know we will receive your questions, and we're going to give them a little bit of time to talk. We'll get back to your questions before we end the webinar tonight.
You know, I might just suggest that if we start getting an avalanche of questions, and you know kind of what we get at the end of every webinar, sometimes we can't get through all of them, but you know, we do the best we can, and then we try and address some of them in later webinars. But if you find that we're being inundated with an avalanche of questions, Daryl, I don't know maybe how you feel about this, but I personally think that we ought to try and address what people would like to hear. Whether they'd like to hear what we give them or not, at least they're going to hear an answer. So then also say to our viewers that it's a different format than we usually use. Usually I bring up a lot of the words of the Founding Fathers and kind of a slide presentation also that we kind of go through to have people see and hear the words of the founders, so it kind of reinforces the perspective. We're going to forego that this time because I believe that based on what we're trying to do here tonight, we'll use our time better if we don't go through a formal presentation and go through more of a, you know, let's just have a little bit of a exchange, like old friends talking, and maybe that'll help better understanding. So Daryl, maybe what do you think about that approach? And I'll turn some time over to you because I know they'd rather hear you than me.
Well, that sounds fine, Scott. You can cut me off at any time and we can answer questions. I appreciate you having me. I'm just going to tell my story to people, and maybe some of the viewers haven't heard it before, but anytime you want to stop, just let me know and we'll take questions.
Sounds great. I really think that your story is compelling, and you know, this thing of war, which we're talking about tonight, what the Founding Fathers established to enter when we couldn't avoid war. And we haven't been doing much avoiding in recent decades, but go on with your story. I'd love to hear it.
Well, I was a young man once, believe it or not, and back in those days, I was a true believer. I read about war, I studied history and so forth when I was in school, and I had two brothers, older brothers that I looked up to. My oldest brother was a World War II veteran, and I saw his life, and quite frankly, he didn't fare too well from what he experienced over there later in life. And he died in his 40s, a relatively young man. And I had another brother next in line to him who was in Korea. He was a Marine in Korea. And he never said anything about it, but I could tell that it affected him too. But it never occurred to me that there was a problem that had occurred in this country since World War II. I mean, if you really think about it, we formed the United Nations to sit down and talk and keep us out of war, to keep some terrible tragedy like we had just gone through as a nation from ever happening again. And since that day, we've been almost constantly at war. So, you know, I never gave that much thought until I actually faced it myself. And when I graduated from college, that was like a natural course for me. You know, I wanted to serve and to do my part, and I wanted to be an officer for many reasons. I wanted to be a leader. I wanted to learn how to be a leader, and to experience the world, to leave the small farm that I was raised on back in East Tennessee and experience the world. And I certainly did that because the Marine Corps sent me all over the world in many different assignments. But I was there at the tail end of the war when there was a lot of cynicism. There was cynicism at home and in the ranks, and people were starting to scratch their heads and say, what's all this about anyway? And, you know, it's like a sports team kind of. People will support the team and the coach as long as they think there's a point to it. They're actually trying to win. And it finally occurred to us that really wasn't the case. And so I had problems with the young men that I was responsible for and the attitudes that all that caused. But You know, I did travel the world. I did see a lot of different things, and I came home from the Far East and was let off a plane at Norton Air Force Base outside of Los Angeles, and you know, I was supposed to go back to my life just like nothing happened, and that was hard because you know, I felt like we all did really that we had kind of been lied to about the whole thing, but nevertheless, I was rather cynical about it and kind of withdrew from that. I wasn't really interested in politics. I was interested in going to law school and trying to learn how to make a living, which I did. And midway through that, through law school, I met Joan, and we got married, and 38 years have gone by, and here we are. You know, we had a daughter along the way, and somewhere along in the early 90s, I was visiting with a man out in Denver. I had a small investment account with him. He was into precious metals and so forth, and I had kind of bought into that. And his name was Don McElvaney. Some of you may know him. Don and I became kind of friends because I would visit him from time to time, and I was in his office one day, and he said, "Who are you going to vote for in this election?" That would have been Bush and Bush the elder and Clinton. And I said, "Well, Don, I think I'm going to sit this one out because I'm not really, I don't feel comfortable voting for either one of these people." And he said, "Why don't you talk to my friend Howard Phillips? He's trying to start a third party, a new party." So I did. I wrote Howard, and we talked by phone, and Howard was putting this party together that became the Constitution Party, and Joan and I became delegates to the first convention, and the rest is history, as they say. But war is something that, as you pointed out earlier, Scott, it's something that should be entered into as a last resort, not a first resort. And really, there are explanations for the way the country has behaved since World War II. It's not an accident. I mean, we made a deal with the world, so to speak, after World War II, and that deal was something like this. You let us run the world. You can be a part of it, but you can't be king. Only we can be king. And in exchange for that, we will defend you. We'll form this organization that we call NATO, which is now 28 nations. At the time, it was only 12, but we took in all those Soviet satellites that we promised we wouldn't. And there's some dispute about that, of course. I mean, President Bush and Clinton both said that didn't happen, but unfortunately for them, Jim Baker, who was Secretary of State at the time under Reagan, kept notes. He kept a diary of the conversations between President Reagan and Gorbachev. But anyway, we told the world that we will defend you, and in return for that, you let us have the world's reserve currency. Anytime you need anything, you have to do it through dollars. And so we've been doing that ever since. We still do it with NATO. NATO is almost entirely funded by the United States, and that frees all these European nations to expend their GDP on their welfare states and other projects that they might have. There may be sinister causes beyond that. I don't know, but if you really think about it, the Federal Reserve makes all this possible. I'm not saying it causes war. I suppose it does, but it certainly makes war possible. Because think about it like this: the Federal Reserve creates money for us to do what we want to do. The United States has to go to the Federal Reserve to get dollars, to get Federal Reserve notes. And it can have those in unlimited fashion, and now it just simply prints the money to pay for its own debt. But if there's no Federal Reserve, then everything we do, we have to ask the question and answer it: how are we going to pay for this? Like when we were coming out of Vietnam, for example, we had incurred all this debt trying to pay for the war, and to have President Johnson's Great Society at the same time, and we started to see that was a problem. So President Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971, and it's been downhill ever since. So back to war and the Federal Reserve, if there's no Federal Reserve, there's no invasion of Iraq, most likely, because the only choice would have been to raise taxes to the point where it could be paid for. If there's no invasion of Iraq, there's probably no ISIS. If there's no ISIS, then there's no Muslim Syrian invasion of Europe and the United States. There's no attack on Libya. There's no forced intervention in Syria. Many, many other things on down the line. So a good way to get foreign policy of the country under control, in my view, would be to start by getting our monetary system under control and start being an independent nation, free to chart our own course without the Federal Reserve freeing us up for all this mischief. And war is something we should use to defend the nation. Talk to anyone who's been there, who's seen it, and they will tell you that it is a barbaric thing. It's not something that we should commit our sons and now our daughters to in a cavalier fashion. We should obey the Constitution, which says only Congress can declare war, not the President. And I admit that's a little more complicated now because we have all these non-state actors out there that we constantly have to fight and to make war on, like ISIS. But as I said, we bring these things to be. We bring them on ourselves, I guess you could say. But that doesn't solve the problem to say that. To say, well, we caused this, or we brought this on ourselves, or we allowed it to happen, doesn't solve the problem because the problem is still there. And you still have to deal with it. ISIS is still ISIS, regardless of why it's there or how it came to be. It's still there, and it's still a threat to the United States. So it's it is no small thing. Some of that threat could be resolved, of course, if we quit inviting it into our own country in record numbers, unvetted, and so forth. So those are some of my thoughts about war. I'm the person who, if I were president, would use it to defend the nation and our way of life, and only for that. And then only as a last resort. I mean, I realize that, there are times when war might have to be resorted to, short of seeing the German army marching up the beaches in North Carolina or something like that. But still, for us, we just go around the world poking our nose into every rattlesnake's nest that we can find. And right now, if you had to pick the one candidate that's out there that's most likely to start World War III or provoke it, I would say that would be Hillary Clinton, because she's the favorite neocon candidate. Many of them are saying now they prefer her to Mr. Trump. And what we're doing in the Far East, I have some real problems with. I mean, I don't want to be in the position of defending China and Russia, but we provoke problems and then we have to solve them. We're very good. We always have been as a country at causing problems and then having to solve those problems, and that's where we find ourselves now. They're very good at putting us in a position where we absolutely have to go to war. There's no other choice. So if we tried and put our minds to solving these problems in advance, and maybe not thinking, we've got an unlimited number of people out there, and we've got all these high-tech weapons and so forth. We just have to use them. I think that would be a good place to start. In the Federal Reserve, that would be job number one for me, and then we could take it from there. So that's my story, Scott. You have anything to say about that?
Hey, Scott and Daryl, I just wanted to interrupt really quick, and maybe there's just a lot of people joining late, and I know we've deviated a little bit from the normal format that we normally do, and I just want to quickly let everybody know that we've done so because we're honored to have Darrell Castle, presidential candidate for the Constitution Party, joining us today, and I'll turn the time back over. I just, we've had so many joining sporadically that I want to make sure they're aware of what's going on, and we're honored.
Again, thanks for being with us, Daryl. This burden of war, and it is the most onerous burden that any nation ever takes upon itself. It's legalized, it's institutionalized. Mass murder by the most powerful mortal force on earth, government. And so the founders had a very, they were kind of students of history, if you will, and they had watched what had happened all across the nations of the world throughout history. And they had seen that largely the monarchies, and that's largely what they dealt with in their day, was monarchies. That was kind of in vogue in their day. But they found that monarchies were so easily enticed into war based upon some perceived offense that the monarch had. It wasn't the people's problem. It was the monarch that was ticked off about something. And consequently, the monarch would engage his nation in this legalized, institutionalized mass murder program. And the people became kind of not just the pawns in it, but the sufferers that had to face it. Their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor were part of that program. Once the monarch got off on a tangent and decided that they had to make their point with some other monarch about who was the biggest, baddest person in town. And so the founding fathers of America established a program. There was to be a deliberative review of the justice, of the necessity, of the costs, all things involved with war. And they put it with the group that was closest to the people that would bleed, the people that would pay their fortunes out, the people that would have their honor at stake. It was something that, it was unique. The people became the arbiters of their future with this through their trusted representatives. You know, the United States created a republican form of government, which it has nothing to do with political parties, although it's been perverted that way nowadays. But a republican form of government has trusted representatives that perform their labors within the bounds that are established by the contract that created their office, that contract being the United States Constitution. So here we have a unique situation. The founders were not warmongers. They knew that war would sometimes be put upon a nation. They knew that they would face it. And they wanted it to be a process that avoided what they had seen throughout history with the monarchs or the leaders of whatever nature they called themselves as they went forward in it. And so they wrote in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, that Congress would have power to declare war. So Congress has that power, the House and the Senate, the House being elected directly by the people in their day, and the Senate being appointed by the states, who would be responsible for paying the bills, because war always causes debt. Always. You don't have a war unless you somehow end up deeper in debt. And that's just the nature of the beast, if you will. So they wanted the people's representatives to be involved. And we've spoken before about this in our webinar series about constitutional protocol, which was well understood by the founding fathers, John Locke being one of the principal agents in enunciating that a power delegated by the people through the Constitution to a body, the legislative body in this case, could not be redelegated, and it couldn't be assumed by anybody else. And so the people said, we'll trust these representatives to do the right thing. So it behooves us as the people to select people that we put into those offices that we might recognize they're going to do the right thing for the right reasons. Now, there's no constitutional authority for us to run around the world being policemen. There's no runner for any injustice that might be. We don't have a charter that says we're going to go slay all the monsters and dragons and everything that are out there. But if that becomes necessary, if the people recognize through their leaders that we've got to step in, you know, and maybe it's before the Nazis walk on North Carolina shores, but when the people, through their representatives, decide that's how it's going to be done, then that's the constitutional approach. It's a deliberative approach. We've heard people through the last few presidential elections talk about, well, I was for the war before I was against it, or whatever. There was to be a solemn vote taken, and it's a sacred vote. Everything, whether you're voting in the voting booth or it's your congressman or senator, when that vote is cast, I truly believe it's a sacred responsibility, because we're talking before God how we're going to use force. And force of government is massive. The shock and awe wars that's really kind of a euphemism to see the massive power that's brought to bear through modern warfare. This total war thing is unbelievable. And so we need to be sure. We can't say, as Congress has done for decades now, in my lifetime, we have never been involved in a war that was constitutional. We've acted like Congress delegated the responsibility to the president to decide, and that's in the works again to reauthorize a War Powers Act for the president, and that will likely occur if we have the shenanigans that have always occurred there. We'll have that happen again, and they falsely, unconstitutionally delegate to the president the authority to decide if we're going to war. That is not acceptable, people. We need to understand that this awesome power is only to be exercised in appropriate manners for the right reasons. And again, if something comes up in the world that we need to respond to, and it is one of those things that you say, as much as we hate it, we've got to be in this, it needs to be looked at through eyes of people that know the people back home are going to die. There will be bloodshed. And just for a minute, Daryl, I mean, there's so many things we should talk about this. I mean, just for a second, let me just spend just a second on something, and then I want to go to the girls in the draft, because that's an abominable direction we're going as a nation. But let's just talk for a second. When I was in the service, I remember spring of 1970, the president had determined that we were going to invade Cambodia. And there was some really, it was shocking to the world. It was shocking to those of us that were serving. Because up to that point, the nation had gone into other nations based upon being, invited, if you will. South Vietnam. We were fighting under a treaty at that point, too. It was the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which is a regional arrangement under the United Nations. And of those regional arrangements, if you read the Charter of the United Nations, you see that they're to fulfill the wishes of the United Nations. NATO has that, too. And that Charter of NATO was signed, that treaty. Read 1949. We'll do it. Maybe we'll do a webinar about that sometime. But these are regional arrangements of the United Nations, and they perform the wishes of the United Nations. That's how we got in Bosnia, for example. That's what we're doing in Afghanistan. But the point of the matter is, I guess going back to Cambodia in 1970, some of us were absolutely shocked. We were invading another country, and that was one that ostensibly we had no war with. It's just that the VC were always running across the border and getting away. But the president said, we're going to invade. And the world, what is the United States doing? They've never done this before. And some of us that were in the ranks, if you will, were so shocked that there was an effort to have some of us take an oath to the president. And in my mind, that was bad too. I was just a young fellow at that time and didn't have the baseline that I have now, but I had a heart and I had feelings, and I could say, this is wrong. We took an oath to uphold the Constitution. And under that oath, the president is not above the law. And the president cannot perform the labors of carrying war unless it's been appropriately entered into. And then he becomes, as Hamilton said in the 69th Federalist paper, like the first general or first admiral. He is not the perpetrator of the war. But at any rate, some of us were asked to, I don't know how widely this was, when we had a couple of stripes on my arm. They wanted us to take an oath to the presidency. In a way, they were creating a Praetorian Guard, a palace guard, if you will. And that seemed un-American to me. It was just wrong. As young as I was and inexperienced in the world, it seemed like the wrong thing to do. And so the reason I bring this up is not to stir old pots, but to make the point. We invade nations without a whimper anymore, without anybody even scratching their head. It happens like clockwork. We go into nations and with our shock and awe war, and we do that without any constitutional authority. If you're looking at the plain English words of the Constitution, it has become a way of doing business, and it's a tragic situation. And America needs to return to its foundation again to be able to do the right thing. Now, just for a second, I mean, I've probably said more than I should have about that, and I'd like to get Daryl's insight and perspective on this, but let me preface this a little bit for those that maybe are living under a rock and don't know what's going on. In recent months, they've said that women should be eligible, if you will, to serve in combat units, ground troops, boots on the ground stuff. And historically, as Daryl said, those that have faced war and experienced it know that it is brutality beyond measure. The most obscene things that you can think of that human beings could do to other human beings happen in war. And now we want to say, oh, our young women, our wives, our daughters, our sisters, whatever, should be thrust into that environment and face all of those horrors that honestly, it's difficult to say that you're ever going to be the same when that has happened. We'll have, if these politicians have their way, wives, daughters, sisters coming home in body bags. We'll have them maimed and destroyed, and if their bodies aren't destroyed, their minds will be. And there's a lot of other things that are really, you don't send your little girl out in the street when the bully's out there calling you out. What man would do that? What real man would do that? You face the bully yourself. You don't go out and send a little girl out there to do it. And I say, oh, everybody's going to say, well, women are capable. Well, let's just talk about this for a second. Somebody my size, dressed out in their kit with all of their body armor and everything like that, is going to weigh about 250 pounds. Not that much already, so don't guess at that. But say 250 pounds of body armor and webbing and everything else. If a young woman, 130 pounds, let's say, was dressed out in her kit, she'd be about 180 pounds. So you're moving around with a lot more weight than you're normally used to. And let's say I got in a Humvee accident or got hit by some kind of explosive device, it's on fire, I'm unconscious, and some young woman needs to come and rescue me from that. Problem is, she doesn't have the body strength to do it. And I'm probably going to die, and she's probably going to too if she's got the courage enough to try. And that's a tragic situation. And so I'm really concerned about this. And so there's so many other things to talk about that might be, but there's been an effort in Congress to bring forth a law under the National Defense Authorization Act. It's been expunged from it now. I'm concerned about it. Because of the way they expunged it, they'll bring it back because they're going to study it and then bring it back. But they wanted to have women register for the draft. And I think it's absolutely absurd to think that's how it's going. We don't have, I remember when I was in the service, I saw all these little guys, the Vietnamese, when I first met them. I thought they were all 14 years old. We'd killed all the men. They're just small people. So are young women. And it seemed inappropriate to have the burdens put on their backs too. So, Daryl, maybe I'm rattling my chain too much on this thing, but I'd like to hear your perspective. You're the presidential candidate, and I'm kind of a second-hand rose.
I'm going to interrupt here for just a second and let you both know that there's a lot of questions flooding in, so maybe we can hear Daryl's perspective on the potential draft for women, and then I can start running through some of the questions, because before we know it, we're going to be out of time, and let's kind of see what the audience would like to learn a little bit more about.
Okay, yeah, I should just be quiet and let Daryl take the moment.
Well, I'm not in favor of women in combat. I'm not in favor of women being drafted. Actually, I'm not in favor of men being drafted either. But I will say that it depends on what your view of women is. In our society today, where we see it as a mark of equality, that's the way our society is looking at it. It's the next logical step. But I'd like to take you back for 1 second while I have the floor here to Cambodia. You know, we were fighting in Cambodia long before 1970. The enemy used Cambodia as a refuge, and as commander-in-chief, I'm not so sure I would have been willing to give them a safe sanctuary. We had 500,000 men in that country at the time, and we had air crews down all over Cambodia and Laos, B-52 crews attacking that country. The question becomes, should we have been there to begin with? And we know now that the answer is no, but at the time we were there, and we were trying to protect people's lives. I mean, we had air crews flying out of Thailand across Laos and Cambodia every single day. Some of them shot down in those countries. So, you know, I'm not so sure I would have had an imaginary line on the ground separate me from those people. But hindsight's 20/20, as we know. But if I were president, I'd be president of the United States, not any other country. I'm an America firster all the way, and once there, I would be committed. But you know, looking back at it, I certainly wouldn't have been there. But at the time, there we were. So that's my answer.
Perfect. Do you guys mind if I just run through some of these questions, and then you can kind of go back and forth on who's going to answer, or you know, however you would like to do this? Okay, I think this is a great question. Whose fault is it that we're at war even though it hasn't been declared? Congress authorized the funds. So basically, whose fault is it? Maybe we start with Daryl, and then we'll go to Scott, and then Scott and to Daryl.
Well, that's a good question. Congress not only authorizes the funds, but they abdicate their duty. It's their responsibility. I mean, Congress, Scott said, we elect these people to be responsible. They're not responsible. The problem with them is that the president controls the purse strings, and he decides how much money flows into their districts, how much money flows into their campaigns. You know, the leadership of Congress and the Senate are all in on it. They decide who sits on what committees and all that sort of thing. So it becomes kind of a self-serving thing. But to me, the responsibility for it is laid right back at their feet.
I fully concur. I think Congress, Article 1, Section 7, tells a very specific story about how we get bills, how they become law, and Article 1, Section 9 says specifically the president can't spend any money unless Congress authorizes it by law. And so I think Congress really is key. I think that and they're closest to the people. They're the ones, honestly, the Founding Fathers were concerned about power, and they gave Congress a very powerful base. They have the power of the purse based upon the Constitution, and they have the power of the people behind them. And we, the people, need to stand up and tell our Congress, this is what we need to do. We need to return to the principles the nation was founded on, and let's stop this party nonsense that parties' agendas take precedence over the principles the nation was founded on.
Okay, we're gonna keep moving on because we've got a lot of questions and they keep coming in. Okay, this is a good question, and thanks, Jonathan, for sending this in. But doesn't our Christian obligation to be, quote, our brother's keeper require us to intervene on behalf of others when injustices are occurring somewhere else in the world? And maybe, Scott, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Daryl, and we'll just kind of keep switching off that way.
Okay. Honestly, there's this idea of brother's keeper is an issue. And as our brother's keeper, if you will, and if it really truly is an issue, there is a process by which the nation has to enter that situation. You can't just say, oh, by golly, because of our brother's keeper situation, we must respond to this. There's a process where, for example, in Syria, there's been so many situations where we're not sure who the bad guys were. We're not sure who did what to whom. And maybe we were doing some of the stuff ourselves. I mean, and that seems, I almost hate to even say that, but we need to have a thorough understanding before we engage. And it's a constitutional process. We just don't go willy-nilly in there and do shock and awe wars. But I've got a little statement here that I think is pertinent to that question. John Quincy Adams, who was basically a diplomat from the time he was a teenager, said, America has abstained from interference in the concerns of others, even when the conflict has been for principles to which she clings. She goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. So, of course, we look at the Monroe Doctrine that John Quincy Adams had a hand in, as did Monroe and James Madison. And the process is not a knee-jerk thing. And we've seen far too often the politicians of our day that have tried to build a cause for being at war, and we found out later that the cause was unjust and false, that we were lied to. So if we're going to be our brother's keeper, we've got to understand the process and go into it with our eyes open with Congress's involvement. Darrell, I've taken too much time. Give me your answer, please.
My answer was pretty simple. It's no. It's not an issue for me at all. If I were president, I would take an oath to the Constitution of the United States and to no other. My oath doesn't include any other country or people in other countries. That's just the way it is. The United States is not anybody's keeper, and violence just begets more violence. All it does is make the problem worse. Every time you kill somebody in some foreign country, that person has 250 friends that are out looking for you. Every time you sell them weapons with USA stamped on them, same thing. So, no, my oath would be to the Constitution of the United States. That's it.
And if Congress kept their oath, honestly, in answer, I don't know, you said Jonathan, I think, asked the question. If Congress kept their oath, I think that would be the approach we would take. And the president takes a specific oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And we just can't willy-nilly do this. It's our contract. So anyway, go back to your questions. We need to hear them all. They sound good. Are you having to think about the next question? Or maybe somehow your mic's muted.
There we go. I'm off mute. I always say my best words when I'm on mute. Okay, so here we go. This question is going to be directed towards Darrell, and then we'll come back around to Scott, and then we'll just keep moving as quickly as we can. So I hate to say, keep your questions, brief, but let's try to get through as many of these as we can. Most of the military action taken by the nation today is done under some kind of so-called, quote, War Power Act, or some kind of continuing resolution. How does this fit in with what you've said today, and is it constitutional? And Darrell, maybe you can speak towards that.
No, it's not constitutional. And how does it fit in today? It's pretty obvious. It's the excuse for what we do. Now, as I said earlier, it's made complicated by the fact that we fight non-state actors out there like ISIS and so forth, and the president is authorized to take emergency action on behalf of the United States to protect our forces, our people, and that sort of thing. But no, congressional authorization to use force, 60 days, and that's it. That's for the president to act in an emergency if Americans are in danger in some other land or something like that. So no, there's no constitutional basis for that whatsoever.
Perfect. Scott, did you want to talk to that at all, or are you?
I always like to add things, but I do it so much. But I always look back at the way the founders did it. Jefferson, let's take the Chesapeake incident that happened. There was what could be termed an act of war that the British had taken against an American ship, and Jefferson was president, and there was people beating the war drums. They wanted us to take action and declare war against England, and Jefferson said, "It's not my role. It's Congress's role." He took a defensive posture. He protected our assets. He kept our American people from being harmed any further, and he turned it to Congress and said, "It's your decision." And we just don't do that anymore. We put continuing resolutions and War Powers Acts and everything together that presidents fight wars for decades under. And it's, as Darrell said, 60 days. If we had to respond for something, shut them down, bring them home.
Well, let me just say one final thing on that question just for a second. and that is that if we hadn't invaded Iraq, another unconstitutional war, then ISIS probably wouldn't be there, and there certainly wouldn't be the problems in Syria if we hadn't attacked Libya and shipped weapons from Libya into Syria, which the Secretary of State admits we did, the Secretary of State at that time. So none of that's constitutional, and none of it's even moral, let alone constitutional.
Perfect. Okay. So this question from Connie, and thank you for your question, Connie, is directed, let's start with Sarah. I'll just help you here. So we know all is wrong.
I'm sorry, we're not getting your. I'm not anyway. Maybe everybody else can hear you. Maybe you can speak more clearly into the microphone.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me better now?
I can hear you better now.
Audio issues on my end. Okay. Again, this is from Connie, and we're going to direct it towards Daryl. So we know all these things are wrong, unconstitutional, and should never have happened. But how do you see these things changing in the future? How will you actually stop the unconstitutional procedure in the future? If you have the opportunity to be president, and the Senate and the House remain in the state they are currently in, how will you make a real difference?
Well, if I were president, the Senate and the House wouldn't remain in the state that it's currently in. That would be borderline impossible. I mean, the country's not going to elect me president unless there is a sea change of opinion. I mean, it's obvious what I stand for. I'm very clear about that, and if people elected me, then I have to assume that that's what people want. And I would think that a new wave would be happening in Congress and the Senate at the same time. If not, I mean, if you suddenly put me in Barack Obama's seat, that might be an issue, but I'll tell you this. I could go before the American people and say, look, folks, this is what's happening, and this is what's being done to you, and I need you to support me while I try my best to do something about it.
Ronald Reagan was known as the great communicator, and I think that what would, first of all, Daryl's absolutely correct. If there's a new wave of constitutionalism that sweeps across this nation, there's going to be dramatic changes in the Congress, I would assume. But to take the issue to the people and have the people put the pressure on their representatives in Congress, in the House and Senate, I think that's absolutely essential. One other quick thing. Constitutionally, the vice president sits as the president of the Senate. And that would be, although the vice president cannot vote unless it's to break a tie, I think that would be a great opportunity to associate in a manner that would help those people there to use that leverage, to use that position to be able to help encourage their sound thinking rather than just the muddle-mindedness that they've been doing for so many decades.
Perfect. Okay, next question. Sam, thank you for your question. If a nation is attacked, are we compelled to wait for this to happen before this to take place before we do anything? It seems a little bit risky. So will we see a nation's in trouble? Is it something that we want to hold off on, or are we responsible to act? I think is basically what he's asking.
Well, if I understand the question, if it's should the president act in an emergency to protect American forces and that sort of thing, if there's a strategic threat to this country, absolutely, that's his duty to act, and he's certainly authorized to do that. But he's not authorized to make independent war for years without any action from Congress whatsoever.
So what if another nation is attacked, and we can see it's going to be evident that that nation is going to be attacked? I believe the question is do we have a responsibility to step in and protect them when we see this happening?
The way the question is worded, if another nation is attacked and we see that as a strategic threat to the United States, then I think we have a duty to act. But to say we're going to step in and protect them, that's a different thing. I mean, if we're protecting the United States, then yes.
It's interesting to me. I always take an historical perspective, and we look at what happened in World War I. A Serb killed the Archduke of Austria and his wife. Austria declared war on Serbia. Serbia looked to their big brother, Russia, who declared war on Austria. Austria looked to its big brother, Germany. And within weeks, the whole civilized world was engaged at each other's throat. And it was those entangling alliances that the founding fathers warned us against. And this idea of by treaty requiring Americans to go to war on behalf of other nations, we have abandoned that principle wholeheartedly. And again, I think we'll do a webinar in the future about treaties and the founders' perspective on those things. But we cannot be expected to run around the world, fending off every assailant that ever came along. That's what we're doing, and America's largely, it's a hiss and a byword if you want to think of it that way around the world, because we're making enemies of everyone.
Sometimes we give other countries assurances that allow them to behave in irresponsible ways. When we let countries think that the full weight of the United States stands behind them and what they do, they sometimes act irresponsibly. The president just a few days ago flew to Saudi Arabia when the Saudis were all upset about the missing 28 minutes in the 9/11 Commission report, and Congress voting to allow the survivors to sue Saudi Arabia, things like that. The Saudis were upset about that, so he went to Saudi Arabia and he promised them, he gave them assurance that the United States would defend them and the other Gulf monarchies against all enemies. Well, that's a very, very wrong thing to do, because it gives them assurance that we're there for them no matter what they do. So, yes, we have to be very careful about things like that.
All right, so moving on to the next question. But if we are told that treaties with other countries can basically override the Constitution and even modify it, if that is true, aren't we obligated to fulfill the war requirements included in that treaty and enter a war if the treaties stipulate it? And thanks, Jackson, for that question.
Well, that is actually not true at all. There is no obligation and no ability for a treaty to override the Constitution of the United States. And just to make sure that's doubly clear, we should withdraw from the United Nations immediately. They purport to do that, but that's not what the Constitution says, and I certainly would not be bound by any such thing.
So Scott, before you answer, let me just throw this next question out there because of what Daryl said, and I think that both of you can kind of speak to this. This is from Daryl, and thanks for your question. What is the risk that the U.S. will lose its security veto power in the UN? And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the question that was just asked. So with those two questions out there, I'll let you address those.
Well, I'm not sure I heard the whole second question, but let me just say this about that. I think there's been other presidents that have said this about that. Absolutely, unequivocally, the idea that the Constitution can be modified and we can be drawn into war without even constitutional action by the Congress is absolutely absurd. That has been fostered for decades by people that are in a position to try and get us to be engaged in a globalist activity. It's an absolutely tragic thing. Just happen to have here a statement made by St. George Tucker, whom those of you that are regular viewers know that I consider him to be probably the constitutional scholar, the preeminent constitutional scholar of the founding era. He said this. Again, this was back in the this was published in 1803, actually. He said, "Let it be supposed, for example, that the President and Senate should stipulate by treaty with any foreign nation that in case of war between that nation and any other, the United States should immediately declare against that nation. Can it be supposed that such a treaty would be so far the law of the land as to take from the House of Representatives their constitutional right to deliberate on the expediency or inexpediency of such a declaration of war, and to determine and act thereon according to their own judgment?" It's interesting to me that the founding era, they had a clear understanding about these things. And James Madison, without reading his whole quote, he said, "The exercise of a power must be consistent with the object of the delegation." Treaties were not made to be instruments of war. And, well, they can end wars, But I'm saying they can't draw us into war with other nations because another nation was attacked. Totally absurd. The founders knew this. And those that foster this are trying to get us to go along with the United Nations idea that they can pick our battles for us. And that's a totally un-American. Daryl's absolutely right. We need to withdraw from the United Nations. And I would hope that that would happen post-haste.
Okay, so you both basically answered the question that you couldn't hear. I am obviously having a little bit of audio issues today. And maybe Daryl, you want to speak to this briefly. What is the risk that the U.S. will lose its Security Council veto power in the UN?
The risk of that, if we stay in the UN, the veto power itself makes that impossible. But, you know, we shouldn't stay in the UN. We should be an independent nation. That's my view anyway.
Absolutely. Amen.
Okay, so here's another question. Even though war involves debt, doesn't it stimulate the economy?
Well, that's the broken window theory that's been refuted many times ago, many years ago. That's the old story of you know, if Johnny throws a baseball through Mrs. Smith's window, that's a bad thing because her window's broken. And no, that's a good thing because somebody has to make the glass to repair the window and so forth. And using that theory, why not just bomb the whole world and bulldoze everything, and then we could stimulate our economies by building it back. You forget about the lost opportunity that could have been done with that money, the lost lives that could have been used in so many other ways, so many productive ways. So no, that's a terrible argument.
Well said, Daryl. I mean, we use absurd arguments sometimes, and sometimes if we're ignorant in terms of the way we've been taught, we buy into them and accept them as gospel truth. But the money that's available can be used for positive, building, wonderful things. You know, lives can be blessed in so many other ways than trying to convert by the sword, if you will. There's other people that believe in that, but we don't. Well,
the $1 trillion that we spend every year on the defense establishment, if you throw in the security apparatus that goes along with it, could certainly be used in more productive ways, in my view.
Sounds good. Okay, we have about 2 minutes left before we're going to wrap up the webinar, and I want to give you each just a minute or so to maybe wrap up your ideas, comments, anything, and again, thank you both for being here today. So Scott, we'll start with you, and then we can end with Daryl.
Well, again, as I said, war is the most onerous burden that any nation ever faces. This nation was established as a nation of liberty, of peace, of peaceful interaction with other nations. And our Constitution encourages that. And for many decades, that's how we lived. And I would pray that the time will return with a Castro presidency, perhaps, in which the nation might again assume its position as the light on the hill. The nation that shows by example how to be your brother's keeper and how to live in such a way that you're not plundering and causing destruction and death around the world. And that's the way our Constitution was written, and I hope and pray we can return to that. Errol?
Well, I would say, at the risk of sounding egotistical, and I assure you that's not how I mean it, if Scott and I were elected, it would usher in a golden age of peace and prosperity for America, and this would be such a dynamic, growing country again. I believe that with every fiber in my heart. It's all right there for us if we would just reach out and take it, if people would just have the faith to take one step and change. That's all it would take.
Thank you both. Thank you very much for being here. And I really quickly want to remind our viewers that, again, we will be back here next Tuesday, same time.
Scott, I better tell what the next subject is
exactly.
Before we sign up.
Yes,
okay,
and again, they'll find this all on our social media sites. If they do ever have a question as to our next webinar or they need the recording link, they can always respond to the reminder email that they received to tune into this webinar. So Scott, I'll let you talk a little bit about next week's webinar. Okay,
and I'll hurry because recently I was on a radio interview and the host asked me what one thing would restore this nation to its proper foundation. And I think he was probably expecting something like, get rid of the Fed, or get rid of the 16th Amendment and the income tax, or get rid of the 17th Amendment and the way senators are appointed, or something like that. And maybe even how we go to war. And I said, the one thing that I would find would be our salvation, and it's with us as individuals as well as nations, is to get right with God. And I truly believe that. And so next week in this webinar, we're going to be talking about the moral imperative. So regardless of your religious perspective, our perspective is that we have to be a virtuous and moral people in order to continue to have liberty. And so that's the subject we're going to try and review next time, so that we can see, wow, what has this nation lost? Where does it go back to? And it's a far different story than where we are right now in the nation. So that's what it is, the moral imperative.
Wonderful. Thank you. And again, this recording from this webinar and our registration link for next week's webinar will be up on our social media sites tomorrow morning. Scott, thank you so much. As usual, we appreciate your preparation. You did a fantastic job. And Daryl, we are honored to have you with us tonight, and I'm hoping we can continue to have you join us on a regular basis. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, good night, everybody. Have a good night.
Right.